Today's lecture is on ecological and cultural restoration, and this sort of ties together a lot of the themes of the course, looking at how particularly ecological and cultural restoration are related, how they're related to indigenous communities and indigenous management. We're going to start by reviewing the reading a little bit, this Donawatu et al. 2001 paper. I think her and the co-authors do a really good job about breaking down and thinking about how environment impacts culture, and how environmental degradation can have negative impacts on people's ability to practice cultural practices. And normally when a development's going in, there'll be an environmental impact statement, and there could be a human health impact statement. But those typically deal with things like if there's air pollution, how would that impact communities, any degradation to water, things like that. What Jamie and the co-authors, Larry Campbell and others, were really interested in is how does development or changes impact indigenous health? Meaning, how does that impact intergenerational knowledge transfer? How does that impact ability to practice inherent rights? How does that impact elders taking youth out to accessible beaches? That there's a lot more that goes on than just if there's a development, there's an impact and we lose a clam bed. Well, now that clam protein is switched out with chicken nuggets, hot dogs, whatever it might be, and that will have some physiological impact on your body. It's a different source of protein. It could lead to higher cholesterol, things like that. What her and the co-authors were really interested in is how does that impact people's overall wellness, which includes spirituality and a much broader understanding of health. There's a couple good quotes here. Like we say, it's our spiritual food, so it feeds our soul. So it might poison our body, but we'd rather nourish our soul. This is in reference to toxin concerns in seafood, saying that, yeah, I know eating this could have a physiological harm on me, but I'm still going to do it because it nourishes my soul. So other quotes, whenever there's a low tide, you can go out and get clams. It's kind of a ritual that you'd expect, and you'd expect to have for your children. Again, it's another piece of our culture that's lost if that can't be done. And so there's lots of important teachings and stories that can only be shared in certain contexts. And if we lose that context, that ability to go harvest clams, then we start to lose those stories and those teachings as well. So it's a lot more than just a changing of diet, a changing of protein. There's a whole lot that goes into these environmental changes that impact indigenous communities. For this paper, I'd encourage you to kind of read it with the lens of being able to define the problem statement of the manuscript. Why did they create the Indigenous Health Indicator? Was there flaws in the existing infrastructure? What's unique about this Indigenous Health Indicator that required the authors to do this? And what's unique about the methods? So look at the first task. They kind of lay out a number of things. What are the key components of the Indigenous Health Indicator? What are the kind of pillars that are supporting the Indigenous Health Indicator? And spend some time with Figure 4 and kind of be able to explain it. So it's kind of a little bit of a guide on the reading for that. It's a really good paper, and it's worth spending some time with. Some of the Indigenous health indicators that they focused on were community connection, members being able to actively participate in community functions and help each other, particularly in connection with harvest, preparation, and storage of natural resources. So it's community connection around gathering, harvesting, preparing, and storing. Natural resource security, local natural resources, air, water, land, plants, animals, are abundant and accessible and support healthy ecosystems and healthy human communities. The community equitably shares in these natural resources. So having resources there, but also ones that are healthy enough to eat that don't contain toxins. Cultural use, the community is able to perform their cultural traditions in a respectful and fulfilling way using local natural resources. So they don't we don't have to go hundreds of miles away to collect something because our local environment has been extirpated of that plant or animal. Education, knowledge, and values and beliefs are actively passed down from elders to youth. And so this brings in a section of accessibility as well. Places that elders and youth can easily access are often the first ones impacted. Self-determination, that the community develops their own healing, development, and restoration programs. So these are coming from within the community, not externally. It's not, hey, this is what's good for you, so we're going to do it. And well-being, communities maintain connections to meaningful locations, confident that their health and the health of the next 7 generations are not at risk due to contaminated natural resources. So that the foods are not only just abundant, but they need to be healthy. So they need to be healthy, they need to be free of toxins. People need to be able to harvest without fear that feeding this food to elders or young children could have physiological harm to those people. Here's figure 4. This is showing a diagram of it's called a driver response linkages between environmental and social decision processes affecting shellfish. So it's an interesting way of thinking about all of the impacts on a resource, in this case shellfish. And so we've talked about climate change, and we've talked a little bit about water and ocean acidification. All of this goes into habitat for clams and physiological impacts on clams. Storms, sea level rise are washing beaches away, reducing clam habitat. Ocean acidification, poor water quality are reducing the survivorship of clams or the ability to eat them, the toxic content of them. So all this is relating to a change in shellfish harvesting areas, as is coastal planning and shoreline armoring, these bulkheads. If you think about downtown Bellingham with like a seawall, that's effectively cuts off the beach, right? And then when the waves hit that seawall and bounce back, it actually erodes the beach and makes it no longer suitable clam habitat. So this all impacts a change in shellfish harvesting area, which then impacts all those indigenous health indicators. So what they're trying to do is say, okay, if we lose this beach, how is that going to impact these 6 indicators? So it's a way of quantitatively measuring community impact by proposed changes or predicted changes, both in the positive and the negative. It can also be used for, if we restore this beach or if we build a clam garden here, how will it impact these things? And so it can be used on the positive and the negative. When it was originally designed, I think it was mostly kind of that negative intent of future changes. But now Suwannee is kind of leading the charge for identifying areas and perhaps rebuilding a clam garden in a new area to help promote these 6 indicators that are being impacted negatively by climate change and other development. So this is kind of a good overview of how natural resources and culture interact, and we talk a lot about ecological and cultural restoration, eco-cultural landscapes, and it's still kind of like an academic term, and that connection between people and place can have a profound impact on both the people and ideally the place as well, by the reenactment of traditional ecological management having positive benefits on the environment. I'm going to show a quick video here from Troy Olson. This is part of the Salish speaker series, both at Western and Northwest Indian College. I believe there's links in the extra credit if you want to watch. There's 6 to maybe 9 of them out by now. If you want to watch any of those and do a short write-up for extra credit, that's a great idea. This is Troy talking about sort of his journey into learning about materials and weaving and sort of where that journey's taken him. And it's, to me, a really good example of that connection to place, that connection to materials and how that's impacted one individual. So we'll switch over and watch this video here for a little bit.
I take all quit. This way, I ska.
Hej, Stian.
Haishkas Salit. Asyam Nishchalacha Siam Sahanap Hasmin. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. And my hands go up to the college for inviting us to be a part of this today. I'm humbled at this moment, being in the presence of our hereditary chief and his knowledge. But it's an honor and a privilege to be here. I just want to say Haishka. I want to share a couple of stories not long time ago. When I was young, we went and moved down to the village, which was down right over the Marine Drive Bridge, and off going towards town would be off to your right. And I was really small, but there was a lot of people that lived there in that Stallo village. And at that time, I really didn't know my culture. We were a part of a relocation project where we relocated, and then when we came back, we relocated back home to the village. And so I grew up on the river. And Salik and his family was there. And a lot of other people. So I grew up on the river. That was my way of life. That was who I became, a Stallo person. And then there was a lot of fights and a lot of arguments about treaty rights. We had treaties with the government. And then in 1974, it was reaffirmed. So my Shalangin became the Salish Sea, my way of life. I spent a lot of years out in the Salish Sea and out in the San Juan Islands. And a lot of knowledge out there. A lot of good stories, a lot of camping, a lot of hunting, fishing. And but it wasn't until like 4 or 5 years ago a rock, Spirit of the Shwala, our indigenous technology that really had an impact in my story, my events that are unfolding. The cultural orientation of waking up. I didn't carry a traditional name until 3 years ago. Chief Salik, my mate Shirley, others in the community helped stand me up, and I took on the name Sahanap Hasmin. Out in the San Juan Islands at a place called La Lingua. And so that gets me to a more of a culturally oriented place, space. The identity of, or the knowledge of knowing who you are and where you come from. So these weavings here were done on a Salish loom. I'll share some stories a little bit about my young weaving. But I built the Salish loom because I wanted to know about male-female balance. And I really hadn't any idea that it would go into other things, but it has. I did this weaving for Shirley Kusamat. And I was my first Salish weaving. But I just wanted to have an idea what it felt like. See what women, the balance, male-female balance, what they felt, their purpose, their job, their role. Because all I ever did was fish and hunt. But there was other things, spinning of willow. This is some willow bark I got, but I haven't learned how to spin it yet. But it was part of our reef net technology that's very sacred to the Lummi people. And so our chairman, Tim Blue Jr., asked if we would set out our reef nets, our traditional reef nets at Wauchiacan, in honor of our ancestral villages and our treaty reserved rights. So that was another story that we took with our setting of our traditional knowledge. But then it just starts going on and on and on. This is a weaving that I'm doing current. Where's Natalie Beloy? I just want to say thank you for arranging the Museum of Anthropology visit. And we recently had some Salish blankets that were in Vancouver that were collected in the 1800s. Would have had similar patterns, similar colors, not so much on this style. This is a Chilkat style, northern style. This is a Salish style loom. Anyway, they were collected a couple hundred years ago, and they're a really prized collection of Salish art, Salish weaving. And I really hold it dear to my heart because it was the females that did these, and it just is a lot to know, that we have this balance and in Coast Salish lifestyle, and I just want to learn a little bit about it. So I think for the last couple months I've been doing this one, and with Chief Salik, we're kind of transitioning into roots right now, cedar roots, and the earth is waking up and the earth is alive, and so we transition a little bit from this to getting out and harvesting other materials. This was ocean spray that we went and collected just about a week ago. I didn't know if it was going to be the right season, but we went and got them anyway, and I'm thinking that it's a good salmon stick. And then slapat is something that I'm just learning with Chief Salik, our cedar branches and our roots. So we just built this yesterday, our lapat. It's really a nice piece of heavy-duty work. But it's just, I feel like I'm a student, and I'll probably always be a student in the oral world, trying to learn a sense of identity, the knowledge that our ancestors carried with them. It's just a lifelong learning process to have an idea of the old ways, the materials, the bear grass, the sweet grass, the birch, Um, it's quite an amazing experience to all of a sudden have an oral experience where you go through these learning events that are lasting. They have a lasting impression, and they're real worthy of honoring our inherent rights, our Chalangith, our way of life. And I'm thankful for the people that are in my life, the ones that help stand me up in a good way, guide me and show me good things. These are really, really, really good things to learn. They're a lot of knowledge, a lot of skill. And I'm thankful that my hands somewhat stay busy. It's just a lifelong something I'll probably just continue. I'm not a real speaker, but I can BS a good game. But as far as standing up and talking about culture, I am just really more or less being oriented on, thousands of years of knowledge. I'm just thankful and I'm grateful that I'm here in a good way to see each and every one of you. It's been it's quite an honor to stand up here with the Chief Hereditary Siam. It totally is unexpected. I didn't expect it, but I feel privileged that to be here. Thankful for each and every one of you. Haishka. Oh, okay. One more short story. We were doing the work that the chairman asked us to do was to set our reef nets, and at that time, I guess for whatever reason, the chief, he found it in his heart to give me this cedar hat. But it's a hat, it's a style that our ancestors wore in relation to the reef net. And I feel privileged to do that work. And then the chief found it in his heart to give me a vest. So I really carry these dear to my heart because they're from our hereditary Siam. So, Haishka.
And another species that's quite important, arguably underappreciated, arguably as important as salmon, although salmon get kind of top billing when you think about traditional foods, is camas. Camas is a bulb that has a lot of starch in it that you can cook down and provides a lot of nutrition and kind of a sweet flavor as well. And camas was one of the main harvested plants. It was a major source of food in this area. And it is a major source of food. It was traded far and wide for its storage capabilities. And it's a species that thrives well under intensive management. It's a species that thrives well under tilling, of selective harvest, of addition of fertilizer and burning. So it's a species that had been really actively managed for thousands and thousands of years. And we can see areas that are still being managed, and we can see some remnants that need that attention again. So there's two main species of camas, Camas lectilini and Camas quamish. Lectilini is the great camas. It's a larger of the two species, where quamish, the common camas, is a bit smaller. They have a similar distributions, and they kind of do similar things. They're a perennial herbaceous monocot, meaning that they live on for multiple years, and they grow between 12 and 50 inches tall, which is quite huge. The great camas gets quite tall. They have a multi-flowered stem with 6 petals that are pale lilac to deep purple. The color is often a indicator, although here at Western we have a camas patch between environmental studies and Arnson, kind of in the back there where there's the raised garden beds. If you're looking at the parking lot just to the right of that, there's a camas patch. And there are actually some white camas in there that were selectively bred. Here's a picture from Abe Lloyd showing some camas in his hand here. These are sort of like small to medium-sized bulbs. We'll see a couple giant bulbs here in a minute. But this is really what people are after, is this bulb. And to tell the difference between the two, the big difference is the way that the tepals or petals look and the way that they dry up. And so it's kind of hard to tell if you just have one. If you have two side by side, it can be a little bit easier, and then you kind of have to go out at the right time to see how the petals are curving. But the tepals for Lecthinii, the giant camas, as they wither and bloom, they twist together to cover the protective fruit. So they twist together to cover the middle of the flower. Those of Quamash don't do this. When they bloom, Quamash has 5 tepals distinctly curving upward and the 6th downward. So this is the ones we have here at Western are Lecthinii, the great camas. Quamash, the common camas, a smaller species, and it has this one petal or tepal that's facing downward. And these do curl and kind of cover the fruit as they dry. So it's one of these plants that you have to identify during a certain flowering period. You couldn't just go out anytime and identify them. And there's also a death camas, which, as the name implies, causes human illness. One of the key indicators people talk about are white flowers. However, again, the white flowered camas at Western is normal camas. It's just been crossbred. Presumably, actually, rumor has it by a biology professor like 30 years ago. Still haven't quite figured that one out. But white flowers, and then also smaller flowers along a stalk like this, compared to these 6-petaled, much larger flowers. But for harvesting camas, once these flowers are gone, they look rather similar, and the bulbs look rather similar. So it's really important when they're flowering to go out there and make sure you don't have death camas, because it can cause serious illness or death. You do have to eat a fair amount of it to cause death, but a small amount of it will give you a couple of bad days. They both seed, but offsets or budding bulbs is one of the major forms of reproduction. Larger bulbs that are 4+ years old offset at the highest rate, and so here's Brenda Beckwith, who did a beautiful PhD thesis on camas. And now you can see, before Abe had a fair number in his hand, and here's one big bulb with a couple offsets here. So you can harvest this bulb, replant the offsets, and then they will grow into new camas. And so it's a way of harvesting camas and then actually replanting 2. And so it's a good way to sustain your camas beds. Now, again, it's hard to understate the importance of camas. They would say a family could collect 6 50-pound sacks in 2 days of camas. Traditionally, a family would gather as much as about 4,500 pounds a year. So this is both a major food source throughout the year and also a major trade item. So there's a fair amount of work that goes into this. Its areas were owned, or the proprietorship would be done by women, and so you would have different areas that were your areas that you had rights and title to go harvest. And as such, you would care for those and ensure that you have enough camas to harvest the next year and kind of rotate the sites around. But this is a major, major food resource. And we'll go into the preparation a bit as well. But it requires a lot of preparation on site. But once dried, it can store for quite a long time. And again, has a massive trade value. So after digging, people would bring seaweed or other fertilizers into this area to help camas grow. You could burn the area, which would also add nutrients and carbon to the soil. And the camas had to be cooked right away. That camas is full of complex carbohydrates that we can't digest if you eat it. Gives you pretty bad indigestion and has some kind of ill effects associated with that. But when you cook it slowly for 24 hours or more, it breaks down those complex sugars into simple sugars that are both sweeter but are also easily digestible. So one of the real keys here is as soon as it's dug, it's cooked right away. Once it's cooked, it can be pounded flat and then stored for a long time. But without cooking, it's largely inedible. And so you can Google pit cook, or you can look at this link here that shows one pit cook. Typically, pit cooks are when you dig a big hole, you line it with rocks, start a fire, let that burn for 6 or more hours, and then you sweep away the ashes and the wood, and you've got all these hot rocks. You line that with kelp and green branches, and then you put your food in there. In this case, camas. You can do it with clams and other things as well. But you put down all your camas, cover it back up with more wet things, cover that, let it cook for 24 plus hours, dig it up, and then now you've got perfectly cooked camas. So it requires a fair amount of work. Think about having all these pits for cooking, getting all the wood, tending the fires, tending the pit cook. A ton of work, with each family doing thousands of pounds of this a year. So this is a major activity. It typically occurred sort of May to June, kind of early summerish, late spring, and it provided massive resources throughout the year. It's very, very critical to everybody's annual food budget is getting a lot of camas. This is a video from Michelle Bryce talking about harvesting camas in Victoria and her sort of journey learning about camas.
Camas was our role as Lekwungen women to harvest camas, and those were things that went with your family. Your family would be known to harvest these areas or known to harvest plants or certain foods. I've been harvesting since I've been a little girl. My grandma married into Lekwungen. She's Hulkaminam, so we would harvest all over the island. All kinds of traditional foods, including camas, which we're here today to talk about. So I've been harvesting even here in Megan, which is known now today as Beacon Hill Park. I guess I was raised just with a lot of our traditional foods, and to me it's really important that it's there for the future. And as Lekwungen, I want to reinstate my role as a Lekwungen in managing these ecosystems, including the Garryoke ecosystems, and encouraging others to do the same, to reinstate their roles and to reinstate the landscape and to reinstate the traditional foods and our right to food sovereignty. Camas is a part of many things. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of our identity as Lekwungen women. It's our interaction and connection to the land, and I think it's important for that, for the identity, but also our well-being, our health. The camas is just one of many of our traditional foods within the Garryoke ecosystem. It was one of the main foods. It was one of the foods that people came from all over, First Nations from up the coast and down the coast to trade for camas. And it was a huge time to celebrate the food when we would trade. And this was the women's role to do, and it was theirs to trade. When I'm harvesting, I pull back the soil, and I'll harvest the bulbs that I'd like to harvest and put the seeds into the soil, back into the soil when I'm done. It is really depleted over the past 150 years, and it's been encroached by development, lack of management, invasive species. There's a lot of impacts to the Garryoke ecosystem. We would come here really early in the morning, and we would go all over for bark off of the trees, but this was one spot we came because it was getting harder and harder to find certain barks. And so we came here really early in the morning, just before the sunrise, thinking no one would be around, and walking in with knives to strip the bark, just being caught by somebody who was up early jogging. They were totally startled to see these Indian woman coming through the park with knives. So that's one of my memories here of Megan. There's some Nootka rose and
We're going to return to clam gardens a bit more. We spent some time talking about clam gardens. I have a clam garden lecture from the beach. But I want to talk a bit about the ecological cultural restoration of clam gardens and some of this work that's happening. We've talked about the function of them, but this cultural restoration as well. This is a clam garden that about 12 different bands or First Nations are working on in the southern Gulf Islands. This is just off Salt Spring on what's called Russell Island. And this is the clam garden rock wall. And the first thing you notice is Jefferson Im, who's actually a Paiute former student of mine, is moving seaweed off of the beach. But this rock wall has been built up recently. The rock wall in this clam garden hadn't been actively managed due to a mix of federal policies for about 60 years. Parks Canada and First Nations are collaborating on restoring these beaches and bringing them back to life. As with that, they're rebuilding this rock wall. And so this rock wall is very profound. It's sitting up above the water. It's quite tall, and that's part of that restoration. And we'll learn a bit more about that restoration and how that's both a federal First Nations partnership is working and kind of how it's impacting the community. And again, quickly, we've talked about clam gardens before, but we'll kind of breeze over this. Clam gardens are a way of rolling large rocks or kind of, basketball or smaller size rocks to the low tide line, taking a steep beach, flattening it out, making lots of open, flat beach in the Goldilocks zone for clams, where they're quite fat and happy. They can look a variety of different ways. Here's an image of a really steep wall. So from the clam bed is right up here. And you come with this really steep wall. Here's some others with nice steep walls. This is Orchard Site, which the wall is partially inundated here. Massive, huge beach. Another clam garden rock wall right along here. So it's nice flat beach, steep wall. We're going to watch two videos talking about clam gardens and clam garden restoration. The first one's a bit older and kind of cheesy. It's put out by Parks Canada, but it gives an overview of that project. And the second one's by Hackeye, which is sort of an update. It's like the same project, but a few years later. And it's a lot prettier. But we'll watch both of those, and that kind of fills in some of the ecological, cultural restoration that we didn't fully get into for the clam garden ecology lecture.
Clam gardens were traditionally built by First Nations people to harvest clams and other bivalve species. These gardens consist of a boulder wall built near the lowest tide mark and a terrace on the landward side. Clams were a staple food source for Northwest Coast First Nations for generations. In one way, it was like a pantry of food ready to be eaten when needed. It was also a place of cultural significance where elders shared their knowledge and taught skills to their youth.
My name's Nathan Cardinal. I'm the Clam Garden Restoration Project Coordinator. So the purpose of our activity was to bring out First Nations people, come out and be exposed to science at the Clam Garden.
Well, today we've been collecting bivalve samples. So the students have been helping us dig and collecting all the bivalves or clams that are in each of those holes. Coming up to a weigh station where we identify the clam, take its length, weigh it, and record that. And so we're trying to figure out what the composition of the beach is, so what are all the different species, but also the abundance, so how many of each species is here.
So this is just one piece of the Clam Garden Restoration Project, which is a multi-year, 5 to 6 year project. And part of this initial work that we're doing here is to get baseline data for the project so that when we actually restore the clam garden, we have some before data that we can compare to after data when we have the wall and we're actively managing it.
We've just in the past year started to do excavations within the clam garden walls themselves, and they're showing that those rock walls are reef habitat as well. And so they could be important places to gather whelks or sea cucumbers or octopus or different kinds of seaweeds that like to live on those rocks.
Just seeing like all the different clams and stuff, because I thought there was only one type.
It's pretty cool learning about the history of all the islands and clam gardens and clams. Just the history of everything.
I'm an artistic person, so I like the shell and the drawing on the clams.
What I saw here today was the intergenerational connection to the land. You know, you can hear stories around the dinner table for generations, but if you don't experience those stories, then they're not real. They're only a story. Like today, it become a little more real. But I think when the tide's low, we should make that our classroom.
The students need to really, like, it's awakening for them to be here and study all that. Hopefully that one day they'll be able to be in archaeology and science and really help.
I think it's really important that we wed both traditional and scientific knowledge, because I think essentially they're two halves of a circle, and I think we can learn a lot from each other.
With everyone partnering up, it makes the job so much lighter, and we're able to pursue a goal, look to see, well, what is the answer?
Clam Garden is a place that's been prepared to create the best growing opportunity for clams so you can cultivate them just like you would a normal garden. They're part of our belief system and they're part of our food system, and so we're to look after it that way, maintain it like a relative.
This is a traditional knowledge, and everything we really knew about clam gardens came from our First Nations teachers. We find these wonderful features from Alaska to Washington, and they're actually pretty simple but very intelligent technology. So if you can imagine that you have a natural beach and there are zones for different critters to hang out in the intertidal, and there's going to be a place where the butter clams and little neck clams just do best, because it's the right amount of time exposed to water and time exposed to air. If you build yourself a wall at the front of that beach, through time that beach is going to fill in with sand and broken shell and live shell, and that's going to change the slope of the beach and increase the zone where those butters and little necks do really well. By changing the slope of that beach, you've also changed the drainage, and in doing so you retain water, which the water can warm up. It creates all kinds of nutrients, and those nutrients can feed the baby clams and make them grow faster and happier.
My name is Sky Augustine. My Halkomium name is Huasyanyan. And on my mother's side, I'm from the Stitminas Nation, or the Chemainus First Nation. And today we're working on one of our 2 clam garden sites on Russell Island. Our ancestors built these clam gardens all up and down the coast, and now that this clam garden and these beaches are in the Park Reserve, Parks Canada is working with local nations to care for these beaches. The project is being run in collaboration with 10 different First Nations, and so we have language experts, they're traditional knowledge holders, they are current clam diggers, and it's these people who are helping guide the way that we do it. And it's the first clam garden that's being restored on the BC coast, actually, or anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. So we are working to build up the rock wall and care for this beach as it's been cared for thousands of years.
Our ancestors probably touched this rock, and that satisfies me in a way, is that I'm rebuilding another wall. I could bring my kids and my grandkids actually here to this same beach. One day it'll be just as good as it used to be, and I think this beach will come back to life.
In the future, and when I'm older, I think that what we're going to see is beaches that are absolutely alive, clam gardens that are alive with people and with animals, all up and down the coast.
One form of really important landscape management that's been practiced for thousands of years and is recently part of this eco-cultural restoration is the use of burning. Burning has been used traditionally for a long time to manage landscapes and really fundamentally change the way they look. And these are low light fires that were lit on the landscape that would burn every few years to help recycle nutrients, also keep spaces open, make sure that there's open grasslands for traditional foods, for animals to browse on, to make the landscape easier to move through. So fundamentally, the entire landscape looks different under a traditional management scheme where active management and burning is a large part of it, in stark contrast to sort of a modern forestry management, which is leave it alone, don't thin, don't burn, and over those decades and decades and decades of those policies, all of this woody debris is built up, all of the trees have come compact, very little light makes it to the forest floor, and fundamentally things look quite a lot different. Combined with the fact that we logged most everything, and then now we're looking at secondary growth, mostly densely packed Doug fir compared to what would have been here 500 years ago, which would be a few large cedar trees with an open landscape below that. Fundamentally two entirely different systems. You could think of them as different stable states, really. And the stable state of what's called a savanna landscape of a few big trees and an open grassland was really maintained by burning. That's a key element of that landscape management that is recently being brought back into the toolbox, but for quite a while had been something we didn't have access to, something that we weren't allowed to use for management for fear of fires. I think looking back at the historical record is pretty interesting. Vancouver himself wrote that extensive spaces that wore the appearance of having been cleared by art. He's talking about cruising through the Northwest, looking at these extensive spaces that look like they've been cleared by art, looking at wide open spaces that had this just sort of profound beauty that he wrote about. And the question is how were these big open spaces maintained? How were these areas cleared, these extensive spaces being cleared and kept open? Compared to now, when you go through those same areas, you'll see really densely packed trees, areas that are still quite beautiful, but they don't have that open landscape appearance. And in Turner 99, she's quoting some historic documents that said the natives along the coast had the custom of setting fire to the woods in the summer. And the loss of fire resulted, after this was done, resulted in a short uptick for Garry Oak, but mostly resulted in a lot of Doug fir coming in and shading out a lot of these other plants. Some of the other historical accounts talk about giving the dates of August and July, talking about these fires being lit by First Nations, and they proceeded at a gallop, and they were low and light, to where if one was coming upon you, you could just kind of hop over with your horse, and it wasn't of concern. It wasn't these big, hot, raging fires that burned everything in sight. They're fast-moving, low-intensity grassland fires that could burn through the understory of a tree, not reach up to the upper story, not burn the tree down, perhaps mark the trunk a bit, but not fatally wound the tree. And so once this practice was no longer allowed to continue, then it really changed the forest landscape, because these low light fires were not suppressing things like Douglas fir that shade out many of the other traditional plants, many of the other important plants like Gary oak, and crowd the forest floor, reducing space for things like camas and other really important food plants. We can begin to reconstruct some of this fire record using dendrochronology, the study of tree rings. Dendro, tree, chronology, time. So we can look at tree rings and see when these light fires had happened and begin to reconstruct the timeline to get an idea of frequency. Here, this is some work that was done on Waldron Island, looking at Doug fir and Oregon white oak, which is a Gary oak, woodland habitat. On Waldron Island, which shows here, this is kind of northern San Juans. This is Orcas. This is San Juan Island, Shaw, Lopez. So just up here. And based on his data, he showed pretty interesting story. So his first name is Carson. Carson went out and cored a whole bunch of trees and was able to use dendrochronology to date them. Some of these records are going back to the 1500s up until 2000s. And each check mark here is a fire. And it's pretty interesting that if you look at the yellow line, which is, I think, 1880. Prior to 1880, there's one fire every about 7.5 years. Lots of fires. Obviously, the trees survived because they were alive or they were stumps that were dead, but they recorded multiple fire events. So these trees experienced many, many fires over their lifespan. On average, in this woodland area, there was a fire about every 7.5 years up until 1880. Then after 1880, the mean individual fire was about 103 years. So this is actually kind of 1920-ish. We had not seen a fire. The mean individual fire was about 104 years. So that's a big difference between 7.5 and 104 years. And the big difference is prior to this time period, Waldron was under indigenous management, and with that, there were frequent low light fires. Post, it became under European management, and fire suppression was enacted, and that fundamentally changed the landscape, created a landscape that hadn't existed for thousands of years, really hadn't existed since before the last glaciation. If you think about the glaciers receding, people in the landscape immediately, this area had been under indigenous management since the ice melted and the land was exposed. Now, for the first time ever, it's under a different form of management that has a lot of unintended consequences, and one of which is the lack of burning fundamentally changes the makeup of the forest floor. And here's an image from Waldron. You can kind of see this is closer to that savanna landscape I was talking about. Open grasslands, a couple Gary oaks, really providing a lot of sunlight to the forest floor, a lot of space for traditional plants to grow, a lot of space for herbivores to browse. And these Gary oaks are really important trees. They're down to less than 5% of their traditional range. They produce acorns that are important for wildlife. You can eat them as well. In fact, in my Indigenous Resource Management class, we go out and collect them and process them. So they're a really important food plant and a really important tree that's very much depressed now. And part of that is because of shading from Douglas firs that can grow up taller and shade out the generally smaller Gary oaks. Now this graph is from the same area, and it's showing the establishment year for Gary oaks and Douglas firs. And Gary oaks are here in black, Doug fir are in gray, and then the ones that have been cut at some point in time, they're able to date the stump, and those are the white bars. Now one thing we see is the establishment of most of the Gary oaks that are around on Waldron really came prior to that change in management, right? These are trees that established in the mid-1800s that are still alive today. Gary oaks can be very long-lived, they're very slow-growing, they take a long time to mature. But here we can see that there's this big recruitment event of Gary oaks, and then nothing happened for quite a long time. And nothing happened in the Gary oak world for quite a long time. And then Doug firs really started recruiting, really started filling in the area, shading out a lot of these Gary oaks. And in the 70s, there's an uptick in Gary oaks. This was mediated by people. The reserve manager cleared some area and planted Gary oaks. So this was not done without the intervention of people, but he recognized well before many other folks the value of these Gary oaks and really wanted to help protect them. So this is an intervention, but this kind of shows how many of the Gary oaks we have around today are on the order of 100 plus years old. They're ones that survived the change in management, and they happen to live typically in like really dry areas where Doug firs can't take over. The Gary oaks that lived in wetter areas where Doug firs are quite happy have all been shaded and died long ago. So Gary oaks are kind of hanging on the fringes of their habitat, real marginal habitat, thin soils, rocky areas, pretty dry. And because it's the fringe of their habitat, now they're getting a double whammy where as climate's changing and we're looking at hotter, drier summers, they're going to receive less water and potentially be in danger there. So they're kind of getting hit from both sides. Their preferred kind of wet and happy habitat is full of Doug firs. They can't take over that area. They can't really survive in that area. Their fringe habitat, coastal bluffs, dry, thin soils, it's getting too hot and dry for them. And so while they're at less than 5% of their traditional range, things are not looking good without some intervention. And burning is one way we can think about that intervention. This video is from a different area, but I think it shows a really nice story about the way that burning and materials are related, and burning and landscape management and burning and water are related.
Fire keeps the ground clean, fire keeps our environment clean. Fire is to keep the plants healthy, that they keep growing more materials for us to use. It's a win-win situation for the plant and for us. Every plant is affected by fire. We as basket weavers, we are totally dependent upon the land for all of our materials because we can't go down to Michael's and buy all of our basket materials. And we need a full year, full cycle to gather our materials. This plant is struggling, but if it could get burned and burned back, it would have a whole bunch of new, just really straight shoots come out the top. But you can see how long of a piece that we need. One good thing, if we could have a fire, it brings the springs back. The water level comes up. So the springs hold more water.
Fire is always about water. Why are these still green? These are beautiful. We haven't seen water for a month. Because they're holding water in their root system. Why does the water still in the river, creek down here? Because all these plants are still holding water and letting the water go gently down into the creek. When you open this up, snow, rain is able to get to the root system. And then the root system retains water. What we have done here by opening up this forest and this little ecosystem is we've returned the water.
So for this lecture, I just wanted to kind of bring back a couple of things we talked about, tie them together under this umbrella of ecocultural restoration. I would be familiar with the Vanuatu paper, a couple of key aspects of some of the ecocultural restoration we talked about, but this is mostly just kind of a closing overview lecture talking about how some of the things we talked about are where the rubber hits the road, basically, right? Like these things in practice today. What does that look like? And what are some good examples of that? So with that, Haishka, thank you.